On the 11th of May 1745, Louis Dupont du Chambon surveyed his fortress from behind walls that had taken France 25 years and 30 million livres to build. He had a trained garrison. He had 148 gun positions, a harbour bristling with cannon, and stone walls thick enough to stop anything the Atlantic could throw at them. The men rowing toward his beach were farmers, fishermen, a blacksmith or two. Their commanding officer had never led soldiers in battle. Du Chambon expected this to be over quickly. 47 days later, du Chambon handed over his sword. France's greatest fortress in the Americas, the one Versailles had called their Gibraltar in the West, fell to a fish merchant from Maine. And the reason it happened is not what any military textbook would predict. So how do 4,200 farmers and fishermen with no siege experience take a fortress that cost the equivalent of $6 billion in today's money in less than 7 weeks? Let's be honest about where New England stood in 1744. Not great. France had spent most of the previous 3 decades turning Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island into what you might generously call an armed nuisance, and what New England merchants would call something considerably less polite. Every year, French privateers sailed out of that harbour and raided British fishing vessels on the Grand Banks. The cod trade wasn't a side business for coastal New England, it was the economy. You lose the fishery, you lose everything. In the summer of 1744, it got worse. A French raiding force sailed down from Louisbourg and burned the British fishing settlement at Canso, taking about 50 families prisoner. A few weeks later, a second French force nearly took Annapolis Royal, the only British garrison in all of Nova Scotia. If that fell, France would own the entire eastern coastline. The colonists had been asking Britain for regular troops and naval support for years. The answer was always some version of, yes, absolutely, very soon, we're quite busy. This was true. Britain was fighting Austria and France simultaneously in Europe and had other priorities. New England was, to put it gently, not at the top of the list. So the colonies were on their own. And yet, doing nothing wasn't a real option either, because the French weren't going to stop. They had a fortress, they had a navy, and they had a strategy. New England had fishing boats and a population with a legitimate grievance. It was William Shirley, the governor of Massachusetts, who decided to do something genuinely insane. He proposed raising a colonial army, volunteers, no conscription, no professional officers, no siege engineers, to take Louisbourg by force. The Massachusetts House of Representatives voted on the plan on February 5, 1745. It passed by 1 vote. Pennsylvania flat refused. Benjamin Franklin, who was reportedly in the room when that refusal was drafted, is said to have remarked afterward that it would be a hard nut to crack, but that he was certain the expedition would succeed because all the praying people of the country were on its side. Which sounds like a joke. It wasn't entirely. Connecticut sent 500 men. New Hampshire sent 450. New York contributed 10 cannons. Pennsylvania sent money, barely. What this force would need, beyond volunteers, beyond ships, beyond cannons, was someone to hold it all together. Someone these men would actually follow. Shirley knew exactly who that was. He just needed to talk him into it. William Pepperrell was 48 years old when Shirley came to him. He was not a soldier. He'd never fought in a real war. He'd drilled the Maine militia for years, but drilling a peacetime militia on the Maine coast in the 1730s isn't exactly a crucible of tactical genius. What Pepperrell was, and this matters enormously, was the most trusted man in the province. His father had arrived in New England as a teenage orphan, working the fishing boats at the Isles of Shoals off the Maine-New Hampshire coast. No money, no family, no connections. He fished, saved, bought boats, leased them, and over 20 years built the most prosperous mercantile house in Maine. By the time William Jr. took over in 1713, at 17, after his older brother died, the family business already touched half of coastal New England. Pepperrell expanded it. He sent ships to the West Indies and Europe carrying lumber and salt cod. He bought land from Kittery to Scarborough. He served as Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas for years without any legal training, which tells you something about the colonial legal system, but also something about how completely he was trusted. He was on the Governor's Council for 18 years. He married Mary Hurst, granddaughter of Judge Samuel Sewell, the hanging judge of the Salem witch trials, which made for interesting family dinners, but also excellent social connections. By 1745, Pepperrell was, by most measures, one of the wealthiest men in all 13 colonies. And he knew everybody. Every merchant captain, every militia colonel, every minister, every chandler and blacksmith and shipwright from Maine to Massachusetts. These were his customers, his suppliers, his congregation, his neighbors. When Shirley needed someone to command this army, he wasn't looking for a tactician. He was looking for a man these volunteers would actually follow into something that everyone with military experience said was impossible. Professional officers had assessed Louisbourg's seaward defenses and concluded they were unassailable. The colonists didn't have the ships to contest the harbor. They didn't have trained engineers. They didn't have howitzers properly suited for siege work. They had fishing boats and enthusiasm, which is not a combination that normally ends well. But Shirley understood something that purely military thinking misses. This campaign would live or die, not in the siege trenches, but in logistics. Someone had to recruit 4,000 men from a population that had no legal obligation to go. Someone had to feed them, arm them, get them across to Cape Breton, keep them supplied for weeks, and hold them together when things went wrong, which they always do. That was not a military problem. That was a merchant's problem. Before he accepted, Pepperrell did something that tells you everything about his character and his world. He consulted George Whitefield. Whitefield was the most famous evangelical preacher in the English-speaking world, the man behind the Great Awakening that had swept through New England in the 1730s and 40s. He was staying as a guest at Pepperrell's house in Kittery when Shirley's offer came. Pepperrell asked him what he thought. Whitefield's answer was not a simple endorsement. He told Pepperrell that, if he went, the eyes of all would be upon him. If he failed, the widows and orphans of the dead would blame him personally. If he succeeded, many would regard him with envy and endeavor to eclipse his glory. He also chose the motto for one of the colonial flags: Nil desperandum, Christo duce. Never despair, with Christ as leader. It was, in the most accurate possible sense, a warning disguised as a blessing. Every word of it proved true. Whitefield's endorsement also gave the campaign a religious dimension that Shirley used ruthlessly to recruit. The clergy preached that Louisbourg was a stronghold of Satan and a popish stronghold threatening Protestant New England. The men who signed up were not purely driven by religion, but the framing helped. These were Calvinist New Englanders who genuinely believed they were doing God's work. It made them harder to discourage, which, given what was coming, was useful. Pepperrell accepted. The fleet departed Boston in March 1745. Here's what Pepperrell understood that the French engineers at Louisbourg never fully grasped. The fortress was only impregnable from the sea. The seaward walls were genuinely impressive. Thick stone, Vauban-designed geometry, fields of fire covering every approach from the water. The Royal Battery across the harbour had 40 guns aimed at the harbour entrance. The Island Battery at the harbour mouth had 31 24-pound cannon behind walls 10 feet high and 8 feet thick. If you came at Louisbourg from the water, you were going to have a bad day. From the landward side, though, the picture was different. Behind the fortress, within cannon range, sat a series of low hills. The engineers knew about them. They'd been flagging the landward vulnerability in reports for years. And the French government had, for 25 years, done essentially nothing about it, because the assumption was always that any serious attack would come from the sea. Why would you waste money on walls facing the wilderness? What this meant in practice, if you could get artillery onto those hills, you could shell the fortress from an angle its defenders had never prepared for. Pepperrell understood something else that professional officers, with their European siege experience, might have weighed differently. The moral condition of the garrison mattered as much as the physical condition of the walls. Because the garrison of Louisbourg, by the time the colonists landed, was already half-beaten, and almost nobody outside the fortress knew it. 4 months before a single colonial ship left Boston, On the night of December 27, 1744, the Swiss mercenaries of the Carré Regiment, France's hired soldiers inside Louisbourg, beat the drums at 3 in the morning. Every citizen in the fortress woke up to the sound. The garrison had mutinied. They had good reasons. Their wages were months in arrears. Officers had skimmed the plunder from the Canso raid, the spoils that were supposed to be divided among the troops. The food was bad and scarce. The winter in Cape Breton was brutal. Du Chambon managed to suppress the uprising without bloodshed, but he never actually fixed the underlying problems. He couldn't. The money wasn't there. The resentment stayed. And here's the detail that almost never appears in popular accounts. After the mutiny, Du Chambon didn't call for reinforcements. He should have. He knew his garrison was unreliable, but he was afraid that a distress message might be intercepted and that his own men, aware that he was signaling weakness to Paris, might mutiny again. Exhales. So he stayed quiet. He sat in his fortress with mutinous, unpaid, sulking soldiers and hoped nothing happened.
What happened instead was the Canso prisoners. When the French raided Canso in 1744, they took about 50 families prisoner and brought them back to Louisbourg. Standard practice was to allow prisoners reasonable movement within certain limits, and these New England prisoners, fishermen and their families, people who'd spent their whole lives studying coastlines and harbors, spent months walking around Louisbourg, watching the garrison, noting which cannons were mounted and which weren't, observing the morale of the troops, and in general, conducting the most thorough reconnaissance of a military installation that anyone could reasonably ask prisoners to conduct. When they were eventually released and returned to Boston, they brought the intelligence with them. The landward hills were undefended, the garrison was demoralized, and the fortress that Paris thought was impregnable was, from the inside, barely holding together. This was the information Shirley had when he proposed the expedition. This was the window dot. The fleet staged at Canso, while Commodore Peter Warren's Royal Navy ships joined from the south. Warren had initially refused to come. He had no authorization from London. Then a set of Admiralty orders arrived, directing him to protect the New England fisheries. He interpreted these creatively and joined the expedition. Pepperrell was glad to have him, and Warren was glad to have glory within reach. Their relationship, professionally courteous and personally irritated, would become a subplot of the entire campaign. The landing plan, when it came, relied on speed and misdirection rather than force. On May 11th, Colonel John Gorham led the first wave of boats toward Flat Point Cove. 20 French troops were waiting and opened fire. Gorham's men rowed away, but immediately redirected to Kennington Cove, a secondary landing site about a mile along the coast. By the time the French could reposition, 1,500 colonials were already ashore. Pierre Maupin, the port captain, arrived with roughly 200 men just in time to watch it happen, and not quite enough men to stop it. He retreated. His co-commander surrendered. By the end of May 11th, over 2,000 men were on the ground at Cape Breton. No fortress walls had been breached. Nobody had yet fired a cannon from the landward hills. But the plan was already working. The critical move happened the next morning. William Vaughan, New Hampshire merchant, Harvard graduate, class of 1722, a man described by contemporaries as restless in ways they clearly found slightly exhausting, led a detachment toward the French naval warehouses at Northeast Harbor. His stated purpose was to burn the supplies stored there, which he did, but the wind that morning drove the smoke not harmlessly out to sea, as he may or may not have planned. It blew directly across the water toward the Royal Battery. The Royal Battery was Louisbourg's second largest fortification, 40 guns across the harbor from the main fortress. Its garrison of roughly 160 men looked up from their positions and saw a wall of black smoke rolling toward them. They didn't know where it was coming from. They didn't know how many men were behind it. Their officers, commanding a garrison whose backbone had been broken by the December mutiny, made the decision that no textbook on fortress defense recommends. They spiked their guns and ran back to the main fortress. Vaughan apparently watched them go. He then led approximately 13 men through the gate of what had been, 10 minutes ago, France's second-largest fortification in North America. He sent a message to Pepperrell. The exact wording has been argued about for 280 years, but the substance is confirmed. He had taken the Grand Battery. He and 13 men. Because of smoke. Seth Pomeroy fixed what happened next. Pomeroy was a Massachusetts blacksmith and gunsmith who, finding himself in command of history's most lopsided artillery acquisition, immediately got to work on the cannons the French had spiked. A spiked cannon has a metal rod hammered into the touch hole to make it unfireable. Pomeroy drilled them out. Within days, the colonists had turned 40 French guns, France's own guns, directly on Louisbourg's main walls. If you can imagine how Duchambon felt watching that, the Lettre d'un habitant, the only eyewitness account from inside the fortress, written anonymously by a French resident, captures some of it. He could see colonial troops operating French artillery from across the harbor. He could see Warren's fleet tightening its blockade. He could see the hills behind the fortress filling up with men and eventually with guns. And he could not call for help without risking another mutiny among the men he had left. The siege settled into its brutal rhythm. Cannons fired from the Royal Battery. Cannons fired from batteries the colonists dragged through Cape Breton mud to the landward hills. The guns at Lighthouse Point, hauled overland by Gorham's men, 10 cannons moved through terrain that had no roads, would eventually silence the island battery from an angle nobody inside had defended. The colonial troops built siege lines in wet fog, ate pork and peas, while their journals complained that Cape Breton had not 2 fair days together, and stayed. On May 26th, Warren's fleet caught the Vigilant, a 64-gun French warship carrying 500 men and 500 barrels of gunpowder destined for Louisbourg. Without the Vigilant, there was no relief. France had sent the equivalent of a rescue helicopter, and Warren shot it down over the water. But the siege nearly ended in catastrophe first. Duchambon's problem wasn't arrogance exactly. It was paralysis. He was a capable colonial officer trapped in a situation his superiors had left him no resources to handle. A garrison that had already mutinied once, walls that were stronger on the seaward face than anywhere else, and a government in Paris that apparently expected him to hold out until a relief expedition arrived, without sending him the relief expedition fast enough to matter. What he did have was the Island Battery, the rocky islet at the harbour mouth with 31 heavy guns, walls 10 feet high and 8 feet thick. If the Island Battery held, Warren's fleet couldn't enter the harbour. If Warren couldn't enter the harbour, Pepperrell couldn't win. Duchambon knew this. He reinforced it. He staked his defence on it. The colonials knew it too. And on the night of June 6th, they did something that the numbers say was catastrophic. The plan to storm the Island Battery went wrong from the beginning. The attack was supposed to be a surprise. Boats moving silently across the harbour at night, soldiers scaling the walls before the garrison knew what was happening. What actually happened? The boats were late. Some arrived ahead of others. Accounts differ on whether it was a drunk volunteer or simply a man who'd been in a longboat for 3 hours in the cold dark and forgot he was on a covert mission, shouted something, or fired, or made noise. The Island Battery's garrison woke up. 60 colonial soldiers were killed in the water or on the walls that night. 116 were captured. By any measure, it was a disaster. Pepperrell in his journal doesn't flinch from it. The men he'd recruited, neighbors and customers and fellow churchgoers, were dead in a harbor they'd never seen 6 weeks earlier. 3 days later, a second attempt, another disaster. 189 men killed. Total casualties from the Island Battery assaults, over 365 killed or captured. From a force that had started with 4,200 and couldn't easily be reinforced. Historians who look at this part of the siege usually note that if Duchambon had been willing to follow up aggressively at this point, to sortie from the fortress while the colonial army was reeling, the siege might have ended differently. He didn't. His garrison was not capable of it. The mutiny in December had cost him that option. Pepperrell held the army together. He had no formal authority over men who'd volunteered with no obligation to stay. He used the same tools he'd used his whole professional life: personal trust, direct conversation, the credibility of a man who'd never cheated anyone in a business deal and was not going to start now. The army didn't collapse. Gorham dragged his guns to Lighthouse Point. It took days. Cape Breton mud in June is extraordinary in its commitment to the project of stopping men from moving things. But on June 21st, the battery opened fire on the island battery from a new angle, from the land side of the harbour mouth, not the seaside. The French guns at the island battery couldn't traverse far enough to return fire effectively. By June 27th, the island battery was silent. The same day, a French relief force under Paul Marin, trying to reach Louisbourg overland through Nova Scotia, was stopped at the naval battle off Tatamagouche. The last exit was closed. On June 28th, with Warren's fleet now able to enter the harbour and Pepperrell preparing what would have been a final assault on the main walls, du Chambon sent out a white flag. The negotiated terms were, by the standards of 18th century warfare, generous. The garrison marched out with honours. French civilians were allowed to take their property. Nobody was executed. Pepperrell, the fish merchant, had just completed one of the more improbable military operations in North American history. Take a moment with what just happened. 4,200 volunteers, no professional soldiers, no trained siege engineers, no European military experience at any level of the command structure, took a fortress that had cost 30 million French livres and 25 years to construct in 47 days. Against a trained garrison of over 1,500 with 148 gun positions. Colonial battle casualties for the entire campaign. Roughly 100 killed or wounded in combat. French battle casualties, around 130. The numbers that look unbelievable are the disease deaths during the occupation winter that followed. 900 colonial soldiers died garrisoning the fortress Pepperrell had just taken. More men died holding the prize than taking it. The vigilance capture alone changed the math permanently. 500 barrels of gunpowder gone. 500 reinforcements gone. Historians looking at this campaign still double-check the timeline because the sequence of Vaughan's smoke, the Royal Battery abandonment, Pomeroy's blacksmith work, and Warren's interception of the Vigilant reads less like a military operation and more like a series of extremely convenient coincidences. Except it wasn't coincidence. It was what happens when a man who understands supply chains and personnel and logistics runs an operation that the other side was running on arrogance and unpaid wages. Curious, compare it to 1777, when American forces seized Sugarloaf Hill above Fort Ticonderoga, and British General Burgoyne realized overnight that the impregnable fortress he was defending had an undefended high point that artillery could occupy. He reportedly said, "Where a goat can go, a man can go, and where a man can go, he can drag a gun." The British abandoned Ticonderoga without a fight. Pepperrell's men did the same thing at Louisbourg, except Louisbourg took 47 days and the French made them work for it. The principle was identical. A fortress designed for one kind of attack falls when the attacker finds the ground the defender forgot to defend. Pepperrell was named a baronet on November 15, 1746, the first American-born person ever awarded that title. King George II received him in London in 1749. The City of London presented him with a silver service. A regiment bore his name. He was by any measure the most famous man in New England, and arguably in all of British America. 3 years after the surrender at Louisbourg, Britain gave it back. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, signed in 1748, returned Louisbourg to France in exchange for Madras, India, and French withdrawal from the Low Countries. The diplomats in Paris and London who made that deal had not fought at Louisbourg. They had not buried men in Cape Breton. They had not spent 47 days in fog eating pork and peas and watching their neighbours die on harbour walls. It was a trade. They made it without asking. New England's fury was, by the measured vocabulary of 18th century PU, public record, volcanic.
Governor Shirley, who'd started the whole thing, spent the rest of his career taking out his frustration on the Acadians of Nova Scotia, which is a whole other story with very dark consequences.
Whitefield's prophecy proved itself, line by line. The eyes of all had been upon Pepperrell. Warren and Pepperrell had quarrelled almost immediately over who would govern the conquered fortress, with Warren essentially claiming military primacy and Pepperrell pointing out that he'd commanded the land forces and had letters from Shirley. Britain resolved the dispute by governing the fortress itself and giving neither man the post. Many had indeed regarded Pepperrell with envy and endeavoured to eclipse his glory. That the widows and orphans part was more personal. His only surviving son, Andrew, died unmarried in 1751, no biological heir. Pepperrell adopted his grandson, William Pepperrell Sparhawk, and had the boy's name legally changed. He became acting governor of Massachusetts in 1757, was promoted to lieutenant general in February 1759, the first American to reach that rank, and was too ill to take any command. He died on July 6, 1759, at his house in Kittery Point. The baronetcy passed to the adopted grandson, who became a loyalist during the Revolution, fled to England, and died in London in 1816. His wife Elizabeth died of smallpox on the voyage and was buried in Halifax. The Pepperrell estates in Maine were confiscated by Massachusetts. The title became extinct. Within 60 years of the most famous military victory in American colonial history, the man who won it had been erased from his own country. The fortress itself, returned to France in 1748 and then taken again by British regulars in 1758, the second siege Pepperrell never got to see, fell into ruin after the 7 Years' War. The walls crumbled, the harbour silenced. Cape Breton went about its business. In 1961, Prime Minister Diefenbaker announced that Canada would rebuild Fortress Louisbourg as a centennial project. The reason had nothing to do with history, not primarily. The coal mines of Cape Breton were collapsing and thousands of miners were out of work. The government hired them to reconstruct the fortress, stone by stone, in 18th century French masonry techniques that someone had to teach them first. Former coal miners learning Vauban's engineering principles in order to rebuild the fortress that New England farmers had taken from France. It is, if you think about it for a moment, genuinely strange. The economy that was destroying Cape Breton in 1961 got a jobs program funded by the memory of the man whose commercial networks had helped destroy the French version of that same economy in 1745. Today, roughly 1/4 of the original fortress stands reconstructed on the eastern coast of Cape Breton Island. Parks Canada runs it as the largest historical reconstruction in North America. In 2019, they announced a $9 million flood protection project for the site. The greatest threat to Fortress Louisbourg is now the Atlantic Ocean, which is rising. The walls that stopped 4,200 New Englanders for 47 days are being slowly, politely, undone by water. The William Pepperrell House at Kittery Point still stands. The Lady Pepperrell House, built by his widow after his death, is a National Historic Landmark. Louisburg Square in Boston's Beacon Hill is named for the siege, pronounced Louisburg if you want to annoy people at parties. There is a street in Halifax named Pepperrell. There's a town in Massachusetts named Pepperrell. That's most of what survived. A square, a street, a town. A reconstructed fortress that tourists walk through in summer, past costumed interpreters and rebuilt cannon positions, above a harbour that is quiet now, in the way that places are quiet when something enormous happened there and then stopped. Here is what Pepperrell actually showed. The strongest side in a military contest is not always the side with the most guns or the best trained soldiers. It's the side whose people will stay. Duchambon's garrison had been defeated by its own officers 4 months before a single colonial ship arrived. Pepperrell's volunteers stayed through failed assaults and bad weather and pork and peas because they trusted the man commanding them, and they trusted him because he'd spent 30 years earning that trust. 1 business deal and 1 church meeting and 1 court session at a time. Professional military thinking says you win sieges with siege trains and engineering expertise.
Pepperrell won his with a mercantile network, a revivalist preacher's endorsement, and a blacksmith who knew how to drill metal out of a cannon touch hole. The British gave back the fortress. They kept the lesson, though they never quite gave Pepperrell credit for teaching it to them.